Hey everyone, it's Lumen, and I'm back with part 2 of the sponsored series of the variants of Agricola. This video, we're going to look at Original Edition and Revised Edition and look at the major differences between them, especially strategically, and a lot of details that you can pause the video for that I won't necessarily speak about. So, first of all, the obvious difference about Original versus Revised Edition is printed on the game box. Original Edition supports 1 through 5 players, but Revised Edition supports 1 through 4 players. You can buy an expansion for playing 5-player and 6-player. So, base set, Original supports up to 5, Revised supports up to 4, but can do 5 and 6 with an expansion. Original does not have an expansion for 6 players. The base sets are also pretty different in terms of how much play you can get out of them. The Original Edition base set comes with over 300 cards in 3 decks: the E deck, the I deck, and the K deck. Translated from German, E is for easy, I is for interactive, it's sometimes called intermediate, it's sometimes called, I think interactive is the intended one, and then K is for complex. The differentiation between easy and complex is usually about how much text the card has, how easy or difficult it is to understand the effects of the card. Though I can think of a couple cards in the E deck which do have very long text, so it's not perfect, but for the most part, the E deck is a good one to learn from to start with, but it's not too bad to get into the I deck and the K deck pretty quickly. On the other hand, with Revised, the Revised base game only comes with 96 cards, as opposed to over 300. So that's your starter set. And as a result, you're going to experience a game that's more stale quicker. This card pool size is really good for playgroups who intend to play the game maybe 10 times per year or less. There's enough familiarity and continuity in those 96 cards to allow for that, while if you had a bigger set of cards, you know, you're going to keep seeing cards that you're not familiar with, and the game's not going to shine as much if you're not as familiar with the cards sometimes. So that is something you can say is good about the Revised base set being smaller. It really is great for player groups who don't play much. There is also a little oddity that the Revised base set is a little short on pieces if you play 4-player, especially the wood pieces. So you have to be active on using your multiplier tokens when it comes to managing the game in a physical sense. For wood, and some other resources can run out fast too. Alright, so then the action spaces are another difference between Original Edition and Revised Edition. In the Original Edition of the game, almost every action space is self-explanatory regarding the exact actions you're taking. So, for example, the Stage 5 action that lets you plow and or sow, well, in Revised Edition that's called Cultivation, a fancy word. You could say fancy. But in Original Edition, it's literally plow 1 field and or sow. That's the name of the action space. And the accumulation spaces in Original are +4 wood, +1 reed, +2 wood, +1 clay, +1 cattle, this kind of thing. And the reason that it got changed in the Revised Edition is for consistency on card effects. The publisher found it easier to describe card effects when listing action spaces by a given name, such as, you know, you get an extra wood at the end of the turn that you take cultivation or farmland, etc. That is a better effect description in the publisher's mind compared to how it would be in Original, such as if you take the plow 1 field or the plow 1 field and or sow action space, you know, it does shorten some card effects. So functionally, when it comes to the action spaces, the solo game, the 2-player game, and the 4-player game are exactly the same functionally, even with the changed naming. There are a couple small tweaks for 5-player, and there's one tweak for 3-player. So for 3-player, the resource market in Revised Edition lets you take a reed or a stone plus a food. And in the original game, that was literally just take one resource, and it didn't give a food. It's very weak action space in a 3-player game, so it was buffed a little flexibility was taken out, but I think that's a good thing. Before Revised Edition 3-player, I would always play with a house rule on the take one resource space where we always took an extra food, and it triggered effects of cards because it also gave food sometimes. So I like that change. Personally, I think it does make the strategy more fluid in 3-player to not have to house rule that space and just make the game a little friendlier, because 3-player could get pretty cutthroat based on that action being so bad. Or based in part on that action space being so bad. So then, in 5-player, the serious difference is that in the original edition, there's a +4 wood accumulation space. And that action space in a 5-player game is a first action for someone almost every round of the game. And if it's a part of the game where wood is tight and people keep starting to make sure that they can do something important and you're like going 4th and 5th in a bunch of rounds, you're not going to get access to that 4 wood space. And that effect in the gameplay can be, I don't want to say miserable, but definitely pretty annoying in the odd 5-player game where that does happen, and it can happen. So in Revised Edition, that 4 wood accumulation space is actually split across 3 different spaces. So there's a 2 wood accumulation space, a 1 wood accumulation space, and a 1 wood accumulation space that always comes with 1 reed. So I think that's a fantastic change. It does change the game strategy a little, because in 5-player you do need to like have tactical concerns about the 4 wood accumulation space, whereas in Revised you can usually get a decent wood accumulation space without too much fighting, but it won't be as extreme as a 4 wood pile too often. The 1 reed that comes with one of the wood accumulation spaces also creates another good action in round 1, or at least in relative strength of round 1 actions. Like 1 wood, 1 reed is a totally decent second action of round 1. And it just increases the amount of reed in the game, which is wanted in a 5-player game due to the more room building that I talked about in the previous video. The last functional change that I have noted here is that in 5-player games, in Original Edition, the build room space that's attached to traveling players only allows you to build 1 room and no stables, where in Revised Edition 5-player, they did update that space to allow you to build multiple rooms in 1 action, still no stables. So those are the 5-player changes. Now, of course, 6-player is something that didn't exist in Original. So 6-player, as I covered in the last video, has more majors and new action spaces to try. I do find them fun to try, like in round 1, if you're first player, do you want reed, stone, wood? Or do you want something like wood, reed, food? Is that actually better in round 1? So you get to make decisions like that. Probably not that specific example now that I say that out loud. The other thing that Revised Edition comes with in the box that Original Edition doesn't have for 2 through 4 player counts is an additional action space variant to make the game looser. So this is for players and playgroups who find Agricola a little too tight and punishing. Adding an additional action space to the game will really loosen up the flow of resources and just really add a whole bunch of stuff to the game resource-wise, so that players have an easier time filling out their farm and feeding their families. The additional action spaces in 2-player, I don't know if I've even played it once, but it looks extremely generous. And the additional spaces in a 3-4 player game are the same. It tends to, in my experience, make a 4-player game a lot more like a 5-player game in terms of strategy. And I haven't tried using those additional spaces in 3-player. It seems pretty overkill to me, but maybe your playgroup will like it. So then, next up between Original Edition and Revised Edition is a pile of rule changes. And if you want to read these, you can pause the video, but I'm not going to take the time to read these to you. Okay, the next difference between original edition and revised edition is the deck structure. So the EIK decks from the original game had probably some kind of structure in mind regarding like how many cards give wood, how many cards give food, how many give points, but it wasn't ever published, and to the best of my knowledge, it's not extremely consistent if it does exist. Whereas in revised edition, the deck structure is extremely formalized, and each card has a specific role. So, for example, card number 148 in the revised edition is a 4-player occupation that gives you a place for animals on your farmyard, it says in my notes here. So, no matter what deck you're looking at in revised edition, card 148 will be a 4-player occupation, giving you extra space for animals or helping you with animal placement. No such structure exists in original edition. However, when the original edition allowed the fans to create their own expansion decks on Play Agricola, the Gamers deck and the subsequent Gamers decks, the Play Agricola community did try to match the distribution of cards in many ways compared to the EIK base cards in original. Again, it wasn't super precise, but they tried to get close. So Chris, the admin of Play Agricola, analyzed card types that he found in EIK for the occupations and the minor improvements, and used that as a helping factor in designing the G decks. So those ended up being the Gamers deck, the WM World Championship deck, and the France deck. So these, in some places, are called G1, G2, and G3 as the first, second, and third Gamers decks. A little note about the G deck is that it was supposed to self-balance in some sense. It was meant to be played standalone, and that was a big factor in its design. Looking back, I think a lot of people would think that's probably not something to keep in mind when creating an expansion from here on out. Then for Uwe's expansions, not the ones created by gamers, these include the Netherlands deck, the Belgium deck, and the mini decks for Czechia, Austria, the Z deck, and the Bielefeld deck, sometimes called the Vampire deck. These decks don't really have any mention of card distribution. So Uwe did ask Play Agricola for advice, but Play Agricola at the time was a lot more focused on publishing the WM deck, aka G2. So Uwe didn't get a lot of feedback from Play Agricola for the Netherlands or Belgium decks. And that's probably not why those decks are so unbalanced, but it could be part of the reason. Play Agricola also did give feedback on the Bielefeld deck, but I couldn't find too much feedback there. Okay, and the last thing about the deck structure here, you can find a lot of helpful files on BGG. So the one I have here is a screenshot of the Anatomy of Revised Edition decks, credit to CC Runner on BGG. This is a really great graphic. I'll have the link in the description, but it breaks down what all the decks look like, including how you buy them and how they coalesce into the 180 card decks. Also helpful in the BGG files section, which I'll link to, are Eric Ho's Agricola database. It contains all of the cards ever printed for original edition and revised edition. And my unofficial compendium holds a lot of rulings and card text for the revised edition. And again, links to those in the video description. Okay, so then the last point here is the actual strategy that comes about due to the differences in card distribution between the original edition and the revised edition. Some things are easier to do in original and harder to do in revised, and vice versa. So, most notably, revised edition deck structure means that a lot more, relatively to original, food, building resources, crops, animals, and renovation friendliness are all supported a lot more in the revised edition decks. Now, when you're given the opportunity to have more food and resources and animals and all that, you really want to make a super efficient food engine and find cards that kind of look like the grocer in terms of spending food to get extra stuff. If you can get a humongous amount of food, which is sometimes pretty easy in the revised edition through any means you can find, you can really manipulate the resources that some cards give you effects for. And at high level play, manipulating resources in these ways with the grocer or cards like it, like the clay carrier or basket carrier, you really want to be manipulating your resources, specifically food, when you can spend that food to get a bunch of good stuff. Then on the flip side, in the original edition, you can more frequently find help for your plowing and bonus points. So you can be more aggressive in revised edition, getting help for those plows and bonus points. If you're an original edition player, you probably do want to make that adjustment and focus on plowing and bonus points a little more than you would in the draft to make sure you get help with that, because you are probably used to having a little more access to that. You could also play it like, I'll just be ready to be more friendly to low plow strategies or low bonus point strategies, and that can also work if you are transitioning from the original edition to the revised edition. And vice versa, if you're a revised edition player and are looking to play original, or that's what is at the convention and you want to play it, then be ready for more available plow help, bonus point help, and be ready for fewer ways to add resources or crops into your game. So, as a result, in the original edition of the game, you can end up with game plans that really do center more on focusing on bonus points and hoping that your opponents don't flood too many resources into the game, meaning that a smaller house strategy focused on bonus points can really shine in some original games. That is a lot harder to pull off in the revised edition, just because the card distribution leads to more goods thrown into the game for all the players to have access to. And as a result, in revised edition, you really want to be manipulating your food and other resources, possibly building more rooms as a result to compensate for fewer plows. This kind of thing does lead to the average game being dense in different areas if you look at like final board states between original and revised. All right, so that's all I've got for part 2 here, looking at the differences between original and revised. Thanks for watching. Again, I hope it was informational and entertaining. Part 3, the last part of the series, will cover expansions and where to play online. Thanks.